Hello and welcome to this month's exclusive paid Patreon tutorial. We'll be painting a pansy in watercolor today. For a list of the materials I've used, pause and screenshot this screen. Today I'm going to be painting in my new Viola 100% cotton watercolor book. I'm going to think of something cool for my first page still, so I'm going to skip the first page and just start working in from the second page rather. I've printed off a template which I've included in the Patreon post, and I'm going to begin by transferring the pansy outline onto my watercolor paper. So to do this, I just need a pencil and a ballpoint pen. With the pencil, I'm just going to graphite the back of my outline sketch first. I've moved my watercolor paper well out of the way so that I don't mess up that page with any of the ink from the printout. And then once I've covered that area, I will move on to positioning that template onto my paper and then switching over to the ballpoint pen that I'll use to trace over that outline. And this will help transfer this graphite onto my watercolor paper. Just a handy tip, if you need to see the vein lines of your flower a little bit more sharper and clearer, feel free to take your pencil and just touch up that transferred outline before you start to paint. I'm now going to be decanting the colors that I'm using. This is according to the list. And once I've decanted, I'll start preparing my paint mixtures for the painting. As you can see, I'm using very little, and I always explain to my beginner classes that I run, we need to remember to think about these little blobs of paint as rather pigment, and that we need the pigment plus water to mix our watercolor paints that we are going to be using. So we use very little out of the tube, and most of what we will be using today is well diluted with water first anyway. To mix our first color, I am going to be using a little bit of quinacridone rose and nude gamboge. This is to mix our orange color, and just to give that color a little bit of depth, I've added some of the vermilion. So you can see in my swatches there, the bottom one with the vermilion is a little bit more within my range that I want to work in. The next color I'm working on is for the pinks in the pansy, and so I'm just going to make a very diluted mixture of the quinacridone rose and the vermilion together. The reason why I'm adding the vermilion is to give it a slightly more coral pink color, and again quite diluted, so it's not pure pigment, it's mixed well with water so that we get our light value of that color. Onto the purple that I'll be using for the veins of the pansy, I've just mixed a little bit of quinacridone rose and violet, and for the stronger mixture of that, I'll obviously add a little bit more of the violet and quinacridone rose to get those darker colors. You might not be able to see very strong my color mixing veins on the right hand side, but I'm going to be mixing my greens now. For my lighter green, I'm using some sap green with a bit of burnt umber. The burnt umber I use sparingly, and it's really just to neutralize my green, if that makes sense. So it's not a very strong, vibrant color, but a little bit more earthy and natural looking green. And then I'll be doing the same with a dark green. In my current color palette, it is referred to as deep green. It's very similar to Viridian. And I'll also be adding some burnt umber to that. So in both cases, my light and my dark green, I've used a bit of burnt umber just to neutralize those greens and give me more of the natural looking green that I'm looking for. It's always good to have your paint mixtures ready to go. because while you're busy painting, you can move more easily and switch over from and to the different shades and the different colors that you need. Because I want my petals and the different elements of the pansy to be seen as separate entities, I'll also be focusing my attention on painting areas that are not necessarily adjoining other areas I've just painted. And this is so that the paint doesn't run into areas that it shouldn't. So to begin, I'm starting with just my top right petal. We're going to be painting a wet on wet technique. So my first layer is just painting this petal in clean water, and then into this, while it's wet, I'll start adding in my colors. And I'll be using the diluted version of the orange, my coral pink color, and then a violet for that center. While I wait for this to dry, I'll move on down to the leaf sections of the pansy. And here I am really just painting in my light shade, and I'm going to use that as my wet base for a little bit of wet on wet, where I introduce some of the darker green pigment that I've mixed, or paint that I've mixed, to give the illusion of shadows, or at least starting to bring in that sense of a color shift or a value shift happening within the leaf. And then in another layer, we'll bring in a more defined shadow. Moving on to the left top leaf, it is a little bit darker, so I am going to use the deep green mixed with burnt umber mixture. While still diluted, it gives a different feeling being in shadow, and switching out those colors can help just give the whole painting some 3 dimension. So all I'm doing in this leaf is painting in a flat wash, just a nice consistent flat color, and the intention is obviously to let this dry, come back, and we start adding in some of the details. Moving on to the darker shadows, bringing this detail into the stem, and then I'll maneuver this into the leaf back on the right hand side. We're going to use a wet on dry technique called dragging. So basically I'm going to come in, plot in my darker color, darker values, and with a damp brush I will drag out any of the sharp lines that I would like to obviously have softened. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm adding in some of the stronger shadows. I rinse off my brush, wipe it off, and then I just come and add in a little bit of a damp next to where I've laid in that darker pigment, and it just gives it a base of water to sort of run into a little bit. So with these darker shadows that I'm adding in now, I'll be doing the same thing throughout. I'll lay in my darker pigment, I'll rinse off, wipe off my brush to remove much of that moisture, and then I'm just going to drag it along the sort of edges of where I've painted in these shadows, just to give it a bank of water that it might travel into and soften out those lines. Heading into the left top petal, same process as before, going in first with my clean water layer, and then into that I will add color while this layer is damp. Moving into this leaf, I am going to start establishing some of those shadows, and I'll be using that same dragging technique. So I've laid in my pigment. The lines are nice and sharp, but I don't want them to be. So to soften them, I rinse off, I wipe off any excess moisture on my brush, and I just drag it along those edges to soften those lines out. This leaf underneath is a little bit darker, and then towards the edge where it might be exposed to a little bit more light, it's lighter. So to tackle this leaf, I'm just painting in a dark value for where it is in shadow, and then I'm going to rinse off, wipe off my brush, pick up the lighter version of the color, and then paint that in from the bottom. So we're kind of creating a gradient wash, and I'm just going to remove some of the excess from my brush, and then I will come run through just to even that gradient wash out a little bit, so it's not reactivating some of the darker pigment that might already start drying. And then onto the front facing petal, again just a clean water layer first, and then into that I'll start adding in the color, and we're just going to have a soft diffusion of color, nothing sharp or too contrasty yet. It's still very soft. We're working in our gentle layers. Just to intensify the saturation in these petals now, I'm basically picking up the same color that we've been working with and glazing it over the petal. And this is just gonna add a layer of more of the same color, but because you're working on top of a previous layer, it's a little bit more intense, but still not too much as it is quite diluted. But it's just to help increase that saturation and give the pansy a little bit more depth. Onto my terracotta pot, I have mixed a bit of burnt sienna and burnt umber to give me this lovely terracotta color, and I am going to paint in first with a very light wash of that color. Might pick up a bit of water just to dilute it more, and I'll do a flat wash into this little pot space, then using a darker mixture with the burnt umber and maybe a little bit of the burnt sienna mixed with it to give it that warmth, I will be adding the shadow. While it is wet, it just helps sort of diffuse and make it feel part of the same object. So for now, there are no sharp defining lines. We're working on the foundation of the pot. So I'm establishing these initial shadows, but we'll come in once this is dry and start adding in some of the more sharper, more clear line work that we need. So this might look like an object where it fades from light to dark, but once we've let it dry and we come back in, we can establish that hard line that separates that sort of lip of the pot from the bottom. So for now, it is right that it looks like one funny shaped pot. With my new gamboge color, a lovely warm yellow, I'm just going to brighten up the center of my pansy. I'm also just having another pass at glazing in some increased saturation in the pansy, and this again just to add a bit of vibrancy. For the soil in my pot, I've used a mix of burnt umber, maybe a bit of burnt sienna, and some of the carbon black. This is just to give it that nice dark coloring that we need. I'm going to paint this in to the soil section of the pot, and remember also those stems in the pot are going to be in a little bit more shadow than what they currently are. So I'm actually going to use this diluted mixture of dark brown to glaze over and set the stem portion of the pansy back a little bit and a little bit more in shadow. With our shadow mixture for the terracotta pot, we're going to go back in and define that shape. So just to start, I'm probably going to just paint in this first line by the lip So I'm establishing that hard line for the top section, and then I will paint in the shadow and use a dragging technique just to soften out and make the portion that's on the bottom half a little bit softer, not a super hard shadow. And then moving on to the shadows that are in the lip of the pot, I'm not going to be working all the way down to where it touches the shadow that I've just established in the base of the pot. I'm going to give it a little bit of breathing room. This will just help offset it a little bit and make it appear three-dimensional. And then the same at the top there, I'm leaving that slight gap just so that you can see where, something begins and something ends. That the center portion is dry, I'm just going to bring in with some violet a little bit of a shadow. With a small brush now, I am going to be using a bit of this violet, and I'm going to start working in the veins of my pansy. So this is where I have sort of lost sight of my vein work a little bit, and why I suggested at the beginning, if you have transferred your outline and those lines are quite faint, it might be a good idea to just quickly go over and touch up the vein work. Nevertheless, I'm going to just follow my reference as closely as I can And I'm going to establish these initial lines in my pansy so that it kind of sets them in place for when I come in and do the more contrasted lines. While I'm about it, I'll be doing another round of glazing in for some increased vibrancy and saturation. I am also having a look at my reference for where the sort of shadows would fall, and using the same technique of glazing in, I am starting to plot some of that detail in there just so that it gives the leaf 3 dimension and we start seeing things taking shape. Now that my petals are dry, I'm going to start working in the more contrasted veins. So a lot darker, more concentrated pigment, and starting to plot in that detail. While that is slightly damp, I'm going to use a little bit more of the violet mixture just to increase the shadow here in this third petal and give a little bit more separation between the three entities. This will also soften out those hard lines that we've just painted in, which I am quite pleased about. It just gives it a sort of fuzziness. If you look at a pansy, those lines are not always very sharp. As always, thank you so much for your support here on Patreon. It's always really appreciated, and if you have the chance to paint this pansy, I'd so love to see what you've created. Please share your work in our community groups. It's always very encouraging when we get to see what we all create. You'll find me on Instagram. I'm at heysweet.art, and I've just launched my new website. Find me www.heysweet.art.